Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's Alum Zoom. Thank you for braving the terrible weather to join us on the internet. My name is Melissa Bostrom and I am the Assistant Dean for Graduate Student Professional Development in the Graduate School. And I want to welcome you on behalf of my colleague Molly Starback, who's the Director of the Office of Postdoctoral Services, who is our co-sponsor for today's session. So I want to introduce our special guest for today's conversation, Marc Frahm, who is Managing Director for Health Care-Biotechnology at Cowen and Company. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before coming to Duke to pursue his PhD in molecular genetics and microbiology, which he completed in 2012. While he was a graduate student, he led a team of MBA and PhD students that conducted market research to direct the development of potential new vaccines using a novel adjuvant library controlled by Duke, and then successfully competed in business plan competitions. His doctoral research focused on HIV and TB-induced immune modulations that led to chronic infection. He has co-authored a number of scholarly articles, including a first authored paper that was recognized in 2012 by the Journal of Immunology as a featured article. After graduate school, Dr. Frahm began work at Cowen and Company, an investment bank and financial services organization, as an equity research associate, and he is now Managing Director for Health Care-Biotechnology. We are delighted to welcome him back virtually to Duke today to share his pathway from a STEM PhD to working in the world of finance. For anybody who's new to these conversations with us, we'll begin with the 5 career questions that we ask all our guests and then move on to address questions that came in through the registration. So you can feel free to put questions in the chat or use your raise hand feature if you want to join in the conversation. So before we kick off, please join me in a warm round of virtual applause for Marc Frahm. So Marc, to get started, can you tell us about your background?
Thanks, Melissa, for the great introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, so I think Melissa, you covered most of my background. So yeah, as you mentioned, did my bachelor's in biochemistry, then came to Duke where I got my PhD, kind of studying the T-cell response to HIV and TB, and that was in the labs of Guido Ferrari and Giorgio Tamaris in MGM. And then I went straight from Duke to Cowen as an associate, and now as an analyst. Those are kind of the job functions, and then the corporate title now is managing director. And so for people who don't know what an analyst is in financial services, it's if you read an article in like the Wall Street Journal or some news article that mentions a company who may have like reported earnings, and it says like analysts thought that the company would do $5 in profit and it was really $4. That's me. I'm that person. Or we get on the earnings calls and we ask management questions and write up reports. So that's kind of who I am.
Terrific. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about how you got your job. You followed a pretty unusual pathway for STEM PhDs. Tell us how you found your way into your current line of work.
Yeah. So Molly, who's on the line, gets a shout out here. I did find this exact job through the email list that she ran at the time. I think still exists for postdocs and grad students who were looking to leave academia. So saw the job posting from that, put my resume into the black hole of resume submissions, and it actually worked for me. Got and ended up with this job. Although I would say wouldn't necessarily recommend solely relying on that resume black hole. So, and in terms of kind of what made my resume maybe stand out, I think it was likely that while I was at Duke, I took a few quote unquote business classes. I had gone through this, as you mentioned, Melissa, competing in the startup competition. So some of those kind of experiences outside of the lab that I was able to take advantage of at Duke probably made my resume stand out from from anyone else.
Terrific. And I am just dropping into the chat where anybody in the audience can find those instructions to subscribe to Molly's postdoc listserv. So you should all be on that if you are interested in this line of work. Terrific. So tell us, what's a typical day like at your organization, Marc?
Yeah, so won't lie, we do work pretty hard here, but often in grad school you do work pretty hard as well. So our day, the kind of standard day, is morning, it's about 7 a.m. Companies may start putting out press releases. The companies that I cover, that I'm responsible for kind of tracking, they may put out news, whether that's some sort of corporate update. It's maybe they're releasing data from a clinical trial, any of those types of things. Those are generally about 7 a.m. that those press releases hit. And they may or may not also then host a call at 8 or 9 a.m. to discuss that news. So to the extent that happens in a day, we have to kind of deal with it, and we'll think about how that changes our thesis as to whether this company is a good investment or a bad investment, and put out a note and discuss that with clients who are hedge funds and mutual funds. And then, once you've kind of dealt with that, the market opens at 9:30, and then you kind of spend the rest of your day, either maybe some follow-up calls with clients or working on longer term projects, which could be kind of bigger thought pieces, kind of projecting out to some of those news events that might eventually happen and why we think it's going to go well or poorly for a company, until the market closes at 4 p.m. And then you may or may not get another round of news or press releases from companies, hitting once the market closes. And if news does happen, then that's your next chunk of your day is you got to deal with that news, which might take a couple hours. And if no news happens, then you kind of just wrap up your work on your long-term projects, and then you kind of end the day. So I would say typical day, we probably wrap up more like 6 to 7. Fridays, much more 4:35, 5 o'clock. Fridays in the summer, I would say much closer to like 3:45 or 4. Like you're definitely 1 foot out the door when the market's closing at 4 in the summer. So that's, and then a few times a year you may have kind of data being released at a major medical conference that either you need to go attend in person or kind of deal with online, which those tend to be over the weekend. So there's like a couple times over a year that you have to do something over the weekend, but generally I'm offline all weekend.
Great. That's really helpful context to better understand, what working hard means in that particular organization. So I shared a little bit about your background in graduate school, but I'd love to hear more about what you did to prepare for this line of work and what you would recommend that students and postdocs who are interested in following in your footsteps could do to prepare themselves.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing was took advantage of the fact that, Duke's a pretty great school in a lot of different fields, and at least as a grad student and to some extent as a postdoc, you have kind of access to all those other departments. So while I was at Duke, I took an accounting class. I was actually with the undergrads, but you can take that through Fuqua. And then I also did a management of I think it was called like management of pharmaceutical development through Fuqua. And then there was a class called Invention to Application, which I think still exists, maybe not under that name, but similar format, which led me to that startup competition. So that they formed teams of PhD students, MBA students, handed us various technologies that were coming through the licensing office, where we took us the first semester kind of to learn a bit about, we had, I think, 5 technologies to kind of learn what was going on with all of them. And then you ultimately selected one that you then used the whole second semester of the year to really develop a commercialization plan, which could be kind of a plan to get it out licensed to somebody or a full-on business plan to have a whole biotech around that technology, which is what was the case for mine. And I think that those experiences gave me a lot of practical skills of how to read a financial statement, a bit about the process of how a drug actually gets approved in the United States, and the crazy system of drug reimbursement that we have in this country for how drugs actually get paid for. So, all that was, I think, helped on kind of make my resume stand out, but also helped me kind of figure out that I enjoyed thinking about the market and like, what does the drug market actually want to see? What do physicians and patients actually want to see to use a drug? And how do you kind of show that in a clinical trial, get it approved, get it to market? And if you think about all those issues, and that kind of led me to equity research and thinking about it, like, are companies therefore a good or a bad investment?
Fascinating. folks who are with us in the audience, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to drop that in the chat or use the raise hand function if you want to follow up and ask for more details. So I'm going to move forward and let everybody know this is the final question in my kind of prepared set that we ask of all our speakers. Marc, what is the employment outlook for this field?
Yeah, I would say in terms of getting hired out of grad school to become, or postdoc to become an associate, it's decent, not amazing, but decent. The field here on Wall Street, or this kind of subsector within finance of covering biotech companies, has expanded, I would say, massively while I've been at Cowen in my roughly 10 years. And probably in the last 5 years, it's probably doubled in size. So, we're kind of digesting that as a field. Some of you may be aware the funding environment for early stage biotechs has been absolutely incredible until about the last year, which has led to a lot of layoffs in biotech companies. We've so far been spared from that on our side, and Wall Street is also, you may see headlines, Wall Street is having some layoffs in other areas, but again, mostly sparing people kind of dealing with biotech. So, so far, it looks like we're coming through that pretty well. There's kind of always turnover at the associate level. So there's jobs on Wall Street. Right now, I think my group is hiring. A couple of the biotech analysts right now at Cowen are hiring.
Terrific.
And I guess I should mention long kind of on a longer term view for a career, I would say it's pretty good. Research associate, coming in as an associate, it's really like a training job. Sets you up to either ultimately become an analyst like I did, or you can move to what's called the buy side. So that'd be becoming an investor, working in a hedge fund or mutual fund who invests in biotech companies, or moving into private investing, so like a venture capital fund, or going into a company in some sort of business development, corporate strategy, or investor relations role.
That's extremely helpful to think about, here's how you enter, and then here's how you might kind of follow different paths within the industry. Terrific. You kind of read my mind with that follow-up. So of the questions that came in through the registration, which I'm going to move to now, since I don't see any questions popping up in the chat, but that is not to discourage you, audience members. So do PhD students need experience in finance before they join an organization like Cowen?
So I would say in terms of like actual job experience doing finance, absolutely not. And people do get hired into these types of roles with almost no exposure. But I would say the process of getting hired is probably a fair amount easier. And certainly for us, it's a lot easier if you have kind of something on your resume that demonstrates that you've kind of had an interest and you've acted on that interest in kind of finance, business, something outside of the lab. But you don't need you do not need to have previously been a junior analyst on Wall Street and then gone to grad school or something like that.
Terrific. And then this last question that I have that came in through registration is, looking back, is there anything you would have done differently during your PhD or postdoc to prepare for your career path?
Yeah. It worked out for me, but it probably would have been useful to network more, which I'm sure you guys hammer them on, and probably still applies to me now today for my job, that it would be helpful to network more. And then maybe just for, if I'd done a little bit more coursework at some point in undergrad or grad school in kind of pharmacology or statistics, because I really took almost nothing of either of those areas, just to give it a little bit more understanding of kind of what's going on with the drug in the body, or kind of how clinical trials are analyzed.
I love your advice about networking. I want to dig in on that just a little bit. So when you say you wish you would have done more networking, what do you mean? What would have had value for you in building your network?
I think, if just gotten more exposed, if you want to go into finance, take advantage of that you're a student, or any field really. Take advantage of that you're a student. A lot of people will talk to you because you say you're a student. Once you're not a student, then it becomes much more of a business transaction. through that invention to application course, like it was amazing. Yeah, we would email, pretty high up like CMOs of large companies being like, hey, we're looking at vaccines. Can we talk to you about how one gets approved? And because we were students, they would talk to us. If I was some startup company, somebody working in a company, I absolutely would have gotten rejected, right? I think that helps, one, possibly get you to a job, but also in my particular job, if I had a wider network of people who I had some level of relationship with in various different companies and different investment funds, that would have been helpful. Just kind of ramping up.
Terrific, thank you. So I've got a question here from Julia. What percentage of your time is spent reading reports, attending meetings, responding to emails, etc.? In other words, how much is more introverted or individual tasks, and what proportion of your work is more interactive and social?
Yeah, so I would say when you first start as an associate, it is more kind of inward looking. It's more kind of the process of writing the report, and putting your head down and doing that, or writing or doing the analysis of, kind of trying to make a meta-analysis of different trials, whatever is going on in a report. As you become more senior as an associate, and certainly as you become an analyst, it becomes much more outward facing of discussing those reports with clients, and meeting with companies to ask the questions. Although I would say even as a junior associate, you'll meet with the companies, and because you're working on a report and you've got a follow-up question on some detail about the clinical trial or whatever, and kind of discussing that with them. But so these days, I'm probably more like, I don't know, 70% outward facing, 70, 80%. But when you start, it's probably the opposite.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I want to turn things to the audience for some more questions, either in the chat or use that raise hand feature to let us know you've got a question.
There is one thing I meant to mention on the how to prepare. I mean, if you really want to get into finance, there are a couple things that, from like a credentialing perspective, that you could do. Definitely is not required, but you can take what's called the CFA, which is Certified Financial Analyst, I believe is the level 1 test, which just kind of teaches you some of that practical stuff about financial statements and stocks, to, again, one, give you a little bit of idea of what the job is and kind of some of those processes. Although it's very much outside of biotech, it's more, general finance, right? You can take that. That would help on your resume from just making it stand out that you really want to do this. You can also, I think you can now take what's called the SIE exam. It used to be called Series 7, which is the basic kind of licensing exam that we have to take on Wall Street, with FINRA, one of the regulatory bodies. I believe you can take that now as not an employee yet. You used to have to be an employee.
That's really interesting. Molly's got a question in the chat. Are publications important in this field?
In terms of getting the job, I mean, yes, from the perspective of it shows you like accomplish something in grad school and that, but no, like we're not reading your paper and going to hire you because you made this amazing finding in disease area X or what, that's not what we're doing. We kind of mostly assume you're getting a PhD from a place like Duke or wherever you were before to now be a postdoc at Duke means you're probably pretty smart. So, so you can probably intellectually do this job.
That's great to know. And then Molly had a follow-up question, which is, what about folks who need to negotiate visa requirements as they look for employment? What's the outlook in your sector?
I would say varies by bank. Some are more or less willing to kind of do that stuff. It really varies by time and you'd have to talk to the HR. Mostly it doesn't, I don't, it's not my kind of role to work on that. But we do, I think, sponsor sometimes and stuff, but it depends on the visa status and all that. So it's kind of out of my wheelhouse.
Fair enough. Can you talk a little bit about your the perception of your PhD training in the interview process when you were first coming on board? How was that viewed, or how did you kind of position that as an asset to Cowen when you were interviewing?
Yeah, so mostly I cover smaller, early stage pre-commercial biotech companies, and really those are science questions primarily, right? They're not finance questions, it's science questions. By far the most important question about those companies is, does the drug work? Is it likely to work, or is it not going to? Then we'll worry about the finance of exactly what that drug is worth later, once we know it works. So we almost entirely, and I would say across the street, the vast majority of people on either the bio or cell side working in biotech are MDs or PhDs. So there's really not a lot of explaining that has to happen. There are some people without an MD or PhD running around, but not a lot.
That's great to know. So can you tell us, Kelsey's got a question here. Are there any roles out there that are more geared toward evaluating the technical aspects of investing opportunities as opposed to the financial prospects, such as due diligence into the science? I think this might be what you were just talking
So
about.
that's kind of exactly what I was alluding to just a second ago. That's really most of what we're doing. The building a market model, I can kind of make any drug seem like it's going to be absolutely huge if you want to make it a huge drug, because there's always like lots of theoretical applications. So the biggest question is, which ones do you think are going to work? And then you figure out how big those are. And that could be scientific due diligence, it could be patents, anything like that kind of ultimately impacts the model.
Terrific. We have Mark for a few more minutes, so I want to invite a couple last questions. So while folks type their questions in the chat, Mark, let me ask you about your personal plans in this field. Where could you go out of your current role to move forward?
Yeah, so there isn't a ton beyond being an analyst. We're staying on the cell side, and there's really just like two positions for us as MDs and PhDs. It's being an associate working for an analyst, and then being an analyst. I kind of refer to us as like we're like the professors of Wall Street. So just like a PI, right? If you stayed in academia, there's really you can be a grad student, a postdoc, and then you can be a PI. Like there's not, there are some more, you can get a little bit more into management, right? You could be a chair or do some kind of cross department programs, running of those programs, those types of things. But functionally, you're still a PI of a lab, right? That's kind of the same for us. Like you can get a little bit more into like research management if you wanted, but that's not necessarily the same career path. Longer term, you could also leave again to the same types of roles I listed before as an associate. Generally, you would go in as a more experienced person, from an analyst, a little bit higher tier person into a company or into an investment fund, but it's still kind of the same general options.
Thank you for sharing that. And then thinking about kind of the other end of your career trajectory, do you have any tips or advice for folks who might be just kind of starting out in this field, coming straight out of a PhD or postdoc? Any things that they could do to be as successful as possible when starting out in the roles?
I think, the biggest thing is that if you're interested in this type of work, is that will enable you to, that you'll be curious, you'll be engaged, you'll work hard and kind of really make the most of the opportunity. That's the biggest thing, is just wanting to learn, and which I think fits for most PhDs. And just being eager to do that and kind of doing that extra leg work of not just the immediate task in front of you, but like digging the next step and thinking through like what's that next piece of due diligence I need to look at to really solve whether this drug's going to work or not, or whether a patient's really going to want to take this drug, those types of things.
Thank you so much for that advice. So we hope that those of you who are in the audience with us today, or might be applying for those jobs coming out at Cowen that Marc mentioned, these are steps that you could take to launch your career successfully. I'm going to give one last call for any follow-up questions. All right, then I'm going to thank Marc Frahm so much for joining us today to talk about his experience, his expertise, and his advice for all the graduate students and postdocs and even some recent alumni who are on the call exploring this career path. Thank you so much to Marc. A round of applause for him, and a round of applause to all of you for making time to join us today to continue that learning and learning about how to be a professor of Wall Street today. That's great. I love that, Marc.
Thanks a lot. And everybody, feel free to reach out. Happy to answer more questions offline. So.
Terrific. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.